another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me as always is Mr. Chris Hallstrom. How are you today, Chris?
Well, to borrow a phrase, I am alive and not unwell. So there you go.
I love
How you
that
doing?
phrase. I'm doing all right as well. I'm still hanging.
Good. Well, today we are talking about something that is important. It might not be the sexiest of topics, right? But if you clicked on this podcast, you're already listening to it. You know what we should talk about. But we're talking about archiving projects. Mm-hmm. This is something is way up there where people get excited about you talking about prep work for setting up sessions and stuff. But it is an important thing because just as you've been going through this week.
Yeah, well, actually, the last 2 weeks, really.
Yeah. If not done right, it creates issues, and it's just better to do it right. So we're going to share a few tips about archiving projects.
Oh, yeah. Sexy.
Right? Said nobody ever. But it is important because as we're going to come across here, there are several little bumps and mishaps that can happen if we don't do this right. We've all experienced them. If you haven't yet,
consider yourself lucky.
Yeah, very lucky. Let's just start off with, when do you archive a project?
When it's considered forked.
Yeah.
Forked, yeah. And by that terminology, that means it's done.
Right.
Put a fork in it, it's done, so to speak.
Right. So as soon as it's done, you archive it. Or, would you even do this process for, now you tend to do most of your mixing yourself, but let's say that you should have somebody else mix it. Do you do the archive and then send it to whoever's going to mix it? Because the archiving here is, to me at least, it's very similar to preparing a song to get mixed.
Yes. And I would concur with that statement based on workflow and how my workflow operates at this point.
All right. Basically, when you're done with it, or it's leaving your hands and it's going somewhere else, it's a good opportunity to do this kind of archiving. Well, why? Why would you do this?
Well, in the case of what I'm running into for the last couple of weeks, when you need to dig out a file to either update it, for one, in terms of the mix, or two, update sounds or other things, it's really helpful to have that reference of what it was. And if you are dealing strictly with virtual instrument type things, most people don't keep old computers and old archives of the plugins that were running on those computers around in their setup.
How many times have you come across that? Well, it's like there's virtual instruments, it's just not available anymore. It's like, oh.
There's a lot of them. There's definitely a lot of them. And it's a sad reality to moving forward.
Backed it up, man.
Yeah, sad reality of moving forward through technology. Oh, this is going to be around forever. No, it isn't. More often than not, you're fooling yourself if that's what you think. I'm sure that's what people thought of 24-track tape. Oh, it'll be around forever. Well, yeah, there's still a few people keeping that format alive. Few and far between at this point.
Yeah. So why not just send somebody the Logic file or the Cubase file or the Pro Tools file or whatever?
Well,
why just not do that?
That doesn't mean that they have all of the instruments and other accoutrements that you might have in your particular DAW. Not everybody owns everything, and not everybody owns the same amount of everything that everybody else has. It's, for most people, economically unfeasible.
Yeah, and unless you're one of those people that you're mixing day in, day out on a very high level, where you might try to stay on top of stuff because you see certain plugins and things occur again and again in session files that you might get. Mm-hmm. For your average person, like you said, that's just not feasible.
Well, there's also, as mentioned a little bit earlier, not only is it unfeasible, but there's also the idea of technology moving and marching forward. I have sessions where Native Instruments was at Contact 4. I don't have Contact 4, and it wouldn't run on this machine either. Now, if I revert this machine back to a much earlier OS, could I do that? You're damn right I could. I don't have two computers in the studio at the moment. I probably need to seriously consider doing that in the not so distant future when I start pulling
Yeah.
out some of these archives. It's crazy.
Yeah. Not to pick on Native Instruments here,
No,
but
not at all.
Contact is, I've had a lot of issues with that going to newer operating systems, and they basically fork their legacy versions. Like, yeah, sorry, no, you can't install that on this machine,
Sure.
right? Especially with, I should preface that by saying, especially with the players, the Contact players.
Mm-hmm.
If you have the full version, I think you're a little bit more locked in, but still, it is a pain in the butt to try to get up and running with that.
But yeah, and the big thing in one of these is I just mentioned Contact 4. All it tells me is that there was a Contact 4 there, and unfortunately, at the time, notoriously bad at putting notes in the tracks to know exactly what instrument was in there.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily part of the archival process, but it's not a bad idea. And I know in a very recent episode, we talked about maybe not naming your tracks with ridiculously long track names for your audio files, but most DAWs will have a section just for putting notes on the channel strips. Sure. Highly effective going forward at this point to know what you have and what was done there. It's and a also, problem when you don't have that written down and you're looking at a plugin that doesn't exist anymore on your system because you're opening it on a much newer computer than you had at the time or whatever, and you have no idea what it is.
Yeah, it is. And also, there's not a guarantee that if you didn't save what you had in your old session as a preset, that it's going to pull up the same way as well.
Oh, hell no.
Right?
Not in a newer version.
Yeah, that is something that I'm not too proud to say that I've come across before, because there's been older versions of projects I've opened up and it's like, what did I have there? Oh, yeah, I don't know. And it's not a pleasant feeling.
No.
But that's simply rectified by archiving and doing these kind of things. Besides sending projects to somebody else to kind of work with, there's also, obviously, for the backup purposes. And even if let's hope you never have to open an old project again, but if you need to, you're covered. You don't have to worry about that virtual instrument or that super magic sauce compressor that you had on that guitar track that made it really stand out. You have the audio the way you essentially left it, and you can just pull it up and there's no headache.
Yes. Therein is the real answer to get exactly back to where you were on your tracks. Export the audio with the plugins that you used, whether they're virtual instruments, EQs, what have you. If you want it to be exactly the same when you open it, you export the multi-tracks with that stuff on it.
Let's drill down on that a little bit. How much of that are you including, though? Because when you say that you have the EQ on or whatever, you're not, or maybe I'm wrong, but I don't tend to include things like reverb sends.
I don't include those either.
Right, but you're talking about basically the basic raw track. Yeah, of course.
Track,
if it right, if it's a part of, like, let's say that it's like the edge type of a sound, then I would include the delay there as well, because it's very much a part of that signature kind of sound. But if it's just I just had some ambient reverb on there, I will generally leave it dry, because that might be one of the reasons why I might want to revisit a track and remix it, just to kind of make sure that I have a pure palette to kind of start with.
Yes, and I don't disagree with that. In the effort of doing these remixes that have come up in the last couple of weeks for this particular opportunity, it is not only virtual instruments that have been a problem, it's old guitar amp sims that are no longer around that have been a problem. Can I update those sounds? Sure. But in the stereo mix and what was done previously, it sounds great. It's just a matter of trying to add or correct some other elements that now that I don't have that sound, its problem. And that was because I was mixing within the file that I
In
created
the project
everything
file
in
that
the
you wrote
project
in,
file I
yeah.
wrote it in, which is why I've changed that workflow of going from the writing, editing type file format to exporting multi-tracks that go to a mix file. And that way I have that raw track with the sound as it was exported. And I don't need to worry about what amp sim it was. However, now I do because I didn't do that and I didn't export it that way, unfortunately. And it's a problem. And I'm not the only one that does this. I know there's a vast majority of people out there that just record and write and edit all in the same file, and it's very convenient. It's not a smart way to go when you want to archive and open in the distant future.
Yeah, the only case that I can think of where I might forego that step and I'm sort of mixing in the same project would be if I'm doing things that are, let's say, like library stuff,
Mm-hmm.
where there might be a really quick turnaround. It's just one of those. But then it would generally be a process where you're submitting stems and things as it is. So there is a certain part of archiving kind of going on there, if
Mm-hmm.
you will. Yeah, I agree. We've talked about this ad nauseum on the podcast here in the past about preparing for mixes, but and doing it in a different session
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of reasons. But the sound thing here is obviously a big one because if it is a guitar and it's an amp sim, it's a little bit easier because you're probably dealing with the DI.
Yes.
But if you had, that was the sound. I don't know how I got it, but it sounds freaking great. It's always a little bit more difficult to kind of go back and trying to recreate it. So if you have it, well, then you're golden. You don't have to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the big one for me is definitely with virtual instruments and stuff because I've done that more times than I care to remember. But it's like, oh my God, I thought that was going to be around forever. But like you said, it isn't. It could be companies go under or it's either back from the days of like Mac going from OS 9 to 10.
That was a
Now
big
that,
transition for sure.
yeah, because everything changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, yeah, we're a small developer. We're not going to be able to do that.
And to
So
be the devil's advocate here, you mentioned that if it's a fast turnaround thing for, say, a production thing, it still makes really good, wise sense to archive properly, even on those cases, because that's exactly what this case is.
sure. Yeah. No, I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying that if you have that quick turnaround and you have to just get it out, mixing in the same project, it doesn't mean that it's a bad idea to, once that is completely submitted, that you do an archive of it. Because it could also be like, you know what, that we really like the track, but the guitar is too loud or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that might be one of those cases where they just want a stereo file. Well, no, we just want the track, right? Being able to pull that up and do it again is convenient. If some time has passed when you have to pull up this again, it might not be readily accessible in your memory RAM how you actually did it. So having an archive is very, very handy. We laid out a little bit of why we might do this and why hopefully you hear that it's a good idea, whether you don't imagine yourself opening this track up ever again,
right?
which is fine, right? But at least you have it there and you know that you could. It's still an effective way of backing your stuff up. When you go about bouncing or committing or insert your DAW's favorite vocabulary here of your individual tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that there's vocal tracks or instrument tracks, things that start off in sort of like the analog realm, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
How much processing do you tend to leave on there?
For the multi-tracks?
Yes.
Just the
So,
edited versions.
okay. So again, it's like the raw source audio, if you will.
Pretty much, yeah. Because the mixing and everything else happens in an entirely different file. So I don't print the reverb with it. I don't print the delays with it. I don't print the EQs generally with it. that may change. Which generally speaking, I don't throw EQs and compressors on sounds actually before going to mix at this point anymore. Anyway, I used to do that mainly because I was mixing in the same file that I was creating everything in. Once I started creating a separate step and a separate file for that process of going from the written, edited, raw tracks to the mix step, all that changed.
But let's say that you're one of those people that you don't have a mix template. You just, okay, I'm done. I'm recording. I've written everything in one project file, and now I want to archive it.
Yeah.
Right. I have my mix. So let's say that the export for the mix hasn't happened. Then what I would do is, just like you're describing, I would leave out things like reverbs and delays that are not strictly necessary for the sound of said instrument. So let's say, for example, vocals. I might even include compression in there if it's something, this vocal sounds great, right? I like that sound, right? But reverbs and things, delays, if I use anything else as well, I might leave that off.
Yeah.
I want as pure of the raw file as I can get with it sounding good, assuming you put in a fair bit of work to make it sound good.
In the front end, as we've discussed in episodes past, and what a lot of guys like to say before they send stuff off to a mix engineer, if you have a proper recording engineer, they are generally working to get the final sound on the way in for your raw track. And if that includes the reverbs and delays, well, that's a whole different story. But generally speaking, it usually just is the raw track, whether it's a vocal that's being sung in and they're running a little bit of compression and EQ, printing it to the actual DAW or tape. Same thing with guitar. If you're running a guitar with a DI, chances are you're not really compressing the DI or doing anything special to it, but you might be running a microphone on an amp, and then you're going to have that too. And we have stressed in previous episodes to say, hey, if you are recording an amp and a live guitar and all that kind of thing, it is not a bad idea to capture a DI version of the signal as well. And I will say the same for bass and keyboards. If you have a keyboard part that you're recording out of an amp, but it can also plug in via MIDI, I'd capture the MIDI as well.
So that becomes a part of the export also. Yeah. Or the archive, I mean. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously with vocals and things, I would archive the comped vocal, not have every other take there. So it's like if I end up with like one or so, all of that things that have been possibly time corrected and pitch corrected, assuming it sounds good, that's all going in the file. So now you don't have to do that one more time, because that's another thing. If you're using things like, let's not say a name, but let's any sort of like pitch correcting software, where the created files on the back end might have cryptic names and might not make it to your archived version, let's say. So you would be forced to redo all the pitch correction, and that can be a surprise, let's say, if you're opening up an old file. So bake that into the file while you're doing it. Yeah. As you do in the archive.
And I can say that sometimes if you're not super anal about your archival steps and processes, you can end up with mistakes in your archive. I have one instance in a recent past, in the past year, I should say, with a project that was archived, and I thought it was archived properly. Unfortunately, with the export of a particular vocal track, there is an issue in it, and until I can get an old computer to reopen the original session for that, I can't deal with the issue at hand. Now, there is not a time crunch on getting that particular song done, but mentioned here a moment ago, saying that in the near future, I'm going to need to think about getting a newer computer and reverting the studio machine that I have to a much older OS. That would then allow me to open that archive appropriately prior to the archiving, I should say, and deal with that vocal file and make sure that the issue isn't in the original vocal file, which I am quite sure it is not.
Yeah, it's easy going through things that you're describing. We're sort of like start inceptioning down the rabbit hole of,
Yes.
of archival tracks, but it's not infallible, right? Where you do this, it gives you the best bet to getting back up and running on a mix that you, let's say that it's, hey, with this album that we put out, it's now a 10 or a 20-year anniversary, right? It's much easier to get up and remix those, and for better or worse, but it may or may not be done, but I'm being facetious here. It makes that process a lot easier. And last thing that I want to mention when we do this, because this is something I've probably done, I can't say for sure, but when you're doing this, make sure that you start all your tracks from bar one.
Yes, from the
When
same
you do
start
the
point, of course.
Yes, exactly. That's another thing, especially if you're going in between DAWs. And even that thing in like Logic is not infallible. It does
Ooh,
mess up.
it can, yes.
Yeah.
The other reason behind saying this, and this is one of those things where it's like, why hasn't somebody somewhere in Q&A for the UI stuff in every single DAW done this? And it's been a problem in Logic forever, even from prior to going to Logic Audio. When it was just strictly MIDI, this was still an issue. So it's been around forever in terms of at least Logic and most other DAWs that I'm aware of. A lot of people will open up and start right on bar one because, hey, that's bar one. It starts there, which gives you really no means to deal with the pre-roll prior to bar one. And that can be a problem, especially when you're doing things, as you mentioned, in production music. Oftentimes, hey, can you go back and add something in the intro, or can you do this? And if you didn't plan for this and they want something like make the intro longer, you have a real problem now if you have to suddenly shift everything over multiple bars to add something before everything else. Which is why you and myself and quite a few other people, I just recently ran into someone in the past week when I'm first time working with them, and they also did this, which was something I didn't have to stand up and say, hey, we need to think about this before we hit record. We start things at bar 5.
Yeah.
Because that gives you 4 bars of stuff to work with. And if it doesn't, as you mentioned, you don't add anything there, you're going to have 4 bars of silence, so to speak, if you have to export everything from bar 1. So what? Not a big deal. If you do, though, start at bar 1, well, you're right on the crack of everything that happens. But if there's something that needs to happen prior to that first bar of downbeat, you might have a problem if you don't start on something like, say, bar 5 or whatever.
And that's a little bit of a hangover from bugs in Logic past, where it wasn't necessarily happy starting on beat 1 anyway. Beat 1 of bar 1, because if you had a lot of MIDI implementation and things where it didn't have time to catch up, so there were a lot of artifacts. Yeah. Now, I should say that there is a functionality in Logic, and I'm sure of the DAWs as well, where you can insert time before. If you're dealing with, let's say, like SEMT hits and things, that can create a mess, right? Yeah. But if we're strictly talking about exporting multi-tracks, all your tracks, just make sure that they all start from the same point so that the person then has their DAW on there. Yeah, and they can be agnostic about what DAW that they're using, right? Because everything is going to start the same, assuming you set it up to be at the right tempo and all that stuff, right?
There's one other thing as to why it makes sense. And this happened between you and I in the past week as well. Sent me some files. I tried to put it into the Logic session and hit go to original record position.
Yeah.
And the region did not move. So it's now
Yeah.
like, where is this region supposed to be in the timeline? Because it's not starting at 1, and I need to get this audio into the right spot. That is another very important reason as to why you would start everything and you export it from the very front end, even if there's 10 or 15 bars or more of silence before the sound actually happens. It is because it will line up perfectly with everything else in the session if it's always starting at bar 1.
Yeah, and long gone are the days where we really have to worry about storage space, right? So if you have those, you got your 15-minute prog rock epic, right? But this last little flugelhorn only comes in on minute 14. If you have 14 minutes of silence, it's not going to kill your hard drive. So the trade-off there being everything lined up properly is worth that of just the extra few megs that it's going to take to have that silence baked in the file.
To that end, make sure you come up with an archive process and stick to it, because somewhere down the road, 10, 15, 20 years later, you'll probably have to open something up and, oh boy, you hope you have everything there to do it right. And with that, let's move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got this week?
Well, speaking of a company that we actually mentioned here, Native Instruments, and you have mentioned this before, but Contact 8 is out. One functionality that is now part of this that's being explored by the NI team and hopefully by third parties as well is something called Leap. Now, Leap is, if you're familiar with Output's Arcade, very similar, where you can take loops and phrases and mangle them in real time. And I think it's an interesting thing. So I thought that would be my find for this Friday, and that's Contact 8, and especially the Leap function. What about you, Jody?
I'm going to go with another new channel strip that has been recently announced, and that is the Harrison 32 Classic channel strip, which is being released by Harrison and SSL. Who needs another channel strip, right?
You do. Because you have a channel strip problem.
I do have a channel strip problem. It's always nice to have different consoles to get different vibes and to understand different workflows. This is no different from most other channel strips in that it is a channel strip. It has EQ, it has compression and or limiting gates, it has the ability to do all kinds of things that you would normally get on a console in real life. The difference is, as much as this looks like a real life console and it looks kind of aged, which is par for the course for things to look cool when you're looking at them on screen, there's one other aspect to this that is even cooler that you can't really do with the hardware, and that is for the 3 different sections that they have, you can arrange them in any order you want. It's not a specific signal flow that goes only one way. Thus, if you want the gate to happen after the compression and EQ, you can do that. If you want the EQ to happen before the compression, cool, you can do that. You can arrange the 3 sections in any order that you want, and that is the Harrison 32 Classic channel strip, which gives you the very classic Harrison 32 console sound.
And that's something we mentioned in the past, but I'll leave it at that. All right, cool.
While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. You'll need to be on our email list in order to be eligible for any future giveaways, and we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of this incredible podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word archiving, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page, and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you later, Jody.